I'm Jason from Smoking and Drinking in Space, a sci-fi podcast from a couple guys who think they know sci-fi.
And I'm Rob from Smoking and Drinking in Capes, a superhero podcast from a couple guys who wish they had powers.
And we're part of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're checking out now.
Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others.
And you can find other cool, awesome, geeky shows at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
Welcome to episode 311 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we cap off our tech-focused season 5 by discussing archiving your show.
In this week's Better Podnerings, topics include a new Rode device and Samsung podcast going away.
And finally, in this week's Better Podback, listeners' feedback include Patreon updates and a brewing conflict between Steven and myself. Wait, what?
Lauren, why don't you be our conflict resolution now and start the show?
This is Better Podcasting. We are hobby podcasters through and through, just like you. That's why we are different. We minimize the money talk so that you can focus on building a better podcast.
This is your penultimate season 5 episode of Better Podcasting. It's episode 311. I am Steven, and I am pleased to say SP is here to help do this penultimate episode.
Yes, this is the last prepared topic we have in season 5, and I hope you've been enjoying it. We've had a lot of great topics, a lot of great discussing topics between us and Discord. Disgusting too.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, it's been really fun, and I hope that everybody will enjoy this particular episode, and we have a call to action at the end, so be prepared for that one.
Absolutely, and we will still have one more episode this season, and that will be our annual gear episode. So you got one more 2024 Better Podcasting ahead of you in addition to this episode. So we hope that you enjoy this episode and then come on back next week for the annual gear episode. We got a lot to talk about today with archiving, so let's just get right into it now.
Whether your show is active or you're just looking to wind it down right now, there's a podcast consideration that doesn't get much talk in this podcast advice space, and that's archiving. With podcasting being a digital platform, it's likely that you are rapidly accumulating all those ones and zeros in cyberspace at a very rapid pace. This can be especially true if you happen to be an audiophile or you have a video element to your show. If you're an audiophile, it's likely you're wanting to use and potentially keep those high quality source files. And that's like FLAC files or WAV files, files that are really large, basically, in terms of a compressed file. And if you do video, well, you just can't get away from those large files. Heck, the final published files at 4K for me usually run between 8 and 12 gigabytes for an hour show. So that adds up. But even if you're not one of these, you may be wanting to keep some of your project materials in case of future reference. Some reason you might want to keep a level of your project files includes remastering the final product. Do the George Lucas treatment, right? You have a final product and then you're like, I didn't quite like that. So you remaster it with the final product, maybe possibly using some AI along with there, but you have to have the source files to do that.
I'll just say SP shot first.
I mean, that's always been true. So you could also repurpose the content in promotional or other emerging publishing venues that might not even exist today, or as historical records for your descendants that might be curious about genealogy. You never know. But not everyone wants to keep the highest quality file. They just want to access something should they need it. This means that archiving practices can vary drastically from podcaster to podcaster and from podcast to podcast. But also consider this. What the archiving is can vary as well. For example, there's the aforementioned project files. There's also archiving completed files. And there's archiving production materials such as development notes or documents, archiving show descriptions in the published document itself. And there can also be archiving support materials such as the promotions, the sound bites, and maybe those future higher quality data files that I was talking about a minute ago with a service that doesn't exist yet. Also, in addition to archiving your raw and production files, there's a topic of archiving your entire show. That's right, you're actually getting a twofer topic for this episode because eventually odds are that you will have to think about what happens to your show when you stop producing it. Could be pod fade, could be a completion, one of the two. Do you maintain the RSS? Do you maintain the web page? The files themselves, do you even care if it is available in the future once you stop or complete your show? And what are some of the reasons you might want to maintain the show online in some fashion? And don't worry if you're listening to this thinking this is a sneaky way for us to announce that Better Podcasting is ending and we're trying to archive our own show. It's not. We'll be back for a season 6 in 2025. But we intentionally placed this topic as the final non-annual gear episode topic of the season because it felt fitting to discuss archiving at the end of the season and the end of the year.
All right, so let's kick off this segment talking about our personal archiving practices, and we will start off talking about the files and projects part of this. And let's break this section into 4 main categories. The first is the working documents and the planning materials. The second is the project files and the associated resources with that. The third is the posted and completed files, and the fourth section is the website. In a few minutes, we'll compare this to some alternative ideas, and later we'll discuss archiving your entire show altogether for the audience. But for now, before we describe our practices, we should describe what type of archiving categories you might associate ours with. And that category is quite easily described as pack rats. Yeah, we're the example of a data pack rat that just wants to maintain as much of that source files that you can. And whilst we are both very similar in how we do keep and archive our project materials, I will happily concede that SP actually takes the production crown in the archiving state, which we will come back to and explain in a minute because he does beat me on the archiving practices. So let's kick off talking about the specific working documents and planning materials, because that's something that we share here on Better Podcasting. And for that, we heavily utilize Google Drives for planning our show. This is using Google Sheets and Google Documents primarily. For us, that means that generally maintaining access to these files is not really a heavy lift for us, because in the Google Drive space, these files don't generally take a lot of space out of the Google Drive storage. So our documents are very text-centric, and those tend to remain fairly small. So when it comes to archiving our production materials or our prep materials in Google Drive, we find that it's really just a matter of moving them into a folder. That's really what it comes down to. We have a folder that's literally called archive that we move these files into. And being fully transparent, we're not even that great at managing that. Sometimes it's months or even years before those files get shoved into that archive folder. Really, it just becomes that we're tired of scrolling down a very long page. And then it's like, okay, it's time to shove those in the archive folder. And that is really for our prep materials or our show planning materials. That is the bulk of how we do the archiving for those, because we are already working in an online collaborative storage solution. So we are able to be lazy because we do set up our prep in a way that anticipates that future archiving needs.
And we name our documents with the exact same start, and that involves the episode number, followed by the anticipated date of the recording, followed by the episode title. So for example, for this episode, it's BP 311 for episode 311, space 2024.11.16 and a dash archiving. That's the title for the document. This means that as we work through our files, they're basically kept organized so that when we do shove them in that archive folder, it's easy for us to find them if we ever need to reference it in the future. There's also the Google Drive search, and it's decent for searching the content. So being able to search for the data later in these documents is relatively easy. So I guess yay for Google creepy data mining. Yay, I guess. There is a downside, though, to our process. We are heavily banking on Google Drive and hoping neither of us accidentally mess up the files. Google Documents aren't that great for trying to back up. Yeah, there are some tools, but it's not as easy as, say, having a Word document that is in offline format. So there are some pros and cons to using the Google Docs. And we'll get to one of those cons later on, by the way. Moving on, let's talk about project files and associated resources thereof. We both operate pretty similar on this front. We are pack rats, as Stephen mentioned before. We both work in lossless formats for audio. We keep these files long-term inside of project folders. Now, to get to the specifics here, our individual project file workflows include the following archiving steps. We'll start with Stephen.
For my personal process, I start by creating a project directory for the episode in a SSD, a solid state drive that I deem my production solid state drive. That's where all of my podcast active files go. I basically download the WAV into that folder. I then convert the WAV to a FLAC in that folder. I keep the video file that we've created for that specific podcast in that same folder. And I work in my editor to edit those FLAC files. And then in the process end up subsequently deleting that WAV file because I no longer need it. Then I do all my editing and I produce the podcast in its video and audio formats. And then once that's all posted, that's all out there, and it comes time for me to archive, I basically then separate these files. What I do is I have a folder on my NAS that is dedicated for the project files. And I move the active project files over to that folder, and that is including the project file that had the editing done in it, that includes those FLAC files, and that includes that source video that was recorded while we were podcasting. But for the completed files, they do get separated from their production counterparts, and well, you might have to wait to come back on that.
My process is very similar to Stephen's, but this is where we start to diverge a little bit. So first of all, I also have a 2 terabyte, 2.5 inch SSD production drive as one of the 5 hard drives on my podcasting PC. Those are all currently backed up to Backblaze, and I've used the Time Machine version of the file function to save overwritten files a few times each year. So I do enjoy that. We'll get back to backups in a little bit. On that SSD, I have a folder for podcast production files, just like Stephen. Within the podcast production folder, I have subfolders for each podcast I either co-host, produce, or I'm a regular guest on. And within that show's folder, I keep all the production files that I might need on every show. The intro, the outro, any graphics, that is all within that show's subfolder. I also have subfolders for each episode where I keep all the raw recording files and any intermediate files as well. I round trip and pre-process the files. So I take those WAV files or whatever files I get, could be MP3 files, and I then process them with the effects within Vegas using largely RX10 plugins, but also other plugins. And then I have a final file. It just makes actual editing easier as I'm going along with my process. Stephen and I do slightly different, well, we do majorly different editing processes, which we've discussed before, but that means I have that intermediate file there. Now, I also have replacement file segments that are processed differently to bring out sounds that plugins might mitigate as they are designed to do. For example, if I snap, then a lot of the plugins will actually take that snap out. And if I want that snap in, I will have to replace that certain segment of my file so that I can hear that snap. That's just an example. Also, with the podcasts that I actually produce, I produce shareables. That's what I call them. These are the things that you might find as video on social media, or maybe outtakes at the end, anything like that, bonus audio. And those are rendered during the post-process editing, and those files are saved in the subfolder for the episode. And any specific show art that's produced, such as a specific YouTube thumbnail, will be in that episode subfolder. Also, on that same production drive, I have another main folder for all the Vegas Edit 21 files. It's simpler for me to keep all the show templates and episode production versions for Vegas in one place and not in the episode subfolders. And since all the file formats change with each version of Vegas, I actually have a subfolder for each Vegas version. So, for example, I have a Vegas 19 subfolder, and currently I'm working out of the Vegas 21 subfolder. About every quarter or so, every 3 or 4 months, I go through and move all the episode subfolders to longer term cold storage on my 20 terabyte, 3.5-inch hard disk drive on my computer that's also backed up to Backblaze. And with all that said, it's kind of similar up to this point, but there's one key difference in archiving that is related to this stage.
Yeah, and this is where, SP, I will gladly take that crown and put it on your head, because you get the ultimate archiving crown. Because if you're new to this podcast, you might not have heard about this. SP has a book of SD cards. That's right. He does not reuse SD cards. SP instead takes them, files them in a storage book. Meanwhile, I just roll the dice until it bites me and overwrite my SD card and reuse it. But SP has the ultimate archive because he has this physical book of SD cards that has all of his past raw recordings going back to his Zoom H6.
I wish it would go back to the very first recordings I made on the Zoom H6, but it wasn't for a couple of months that I decided not to keep rewriting over the SD card. And that was based on a lot of the information that we were hearing in the space at the time over SD cards going bad. So I'm like, okay, I'm just not going to chance it. One and done. I'm going to fill up the SD card. And once it's full, I'm going to take it out. I'm going to store it in a little storage book and I'll buy a new one. I have a few times through my over 10 years of recording to SD cards had to go back to the original file on the SD card. It's few and far between, but I have had to do it. And in those cases, I'm like, okay, I'm kind of glad I did this, but it adds up in terms of cost over the course of years. So you're talking nominally $20 to $25 per SD card. They've gotten bigger over the course of the year. So I've needed both less of them and more, because with the H6, I was able to down select the number of tracks I have. And with the Rodecaster Pro 2, I have to record all the files. So even though I'm using larger SD cards, it's getting bigger. Now, I have thought, because I can do it with the Rodecaster Pro 2, of transitioning to for instance, a 2 terabyte external SSD drive and go into the USB 2 and use that capability that the Rodecaster Pro 2 has to record directly to that solid state drive. And that would mitigate the total number of SD cards that I would purchase. However, because my backup right now is a Zoom P8, which also uses an SD card, I've elected not to go through that. And also I've been lazy, just not actually buying one. And you're saying, SP, you're big into backups. You should just have one to record to as a backup on the Rodecaster. And like, yeah, I should. I just haven't done it. In this holiday season, if I find a cheap one, like a 2 terabyte SSD, I might actually pick that up and use that as a recording. But anyway, that's part of my key difference. The other reason why I'm doing all of this is Stephen and I have talked about this very sparingly, but currently, as I'm moving the Starling Tribune over to Pinecast, I'm going back and redoing some of the episodes. And it's a long story behind it, but I am doing some of them, not all of them, but very select ones. And in doing so, in some cases, I have to go back to those SD cards to get the original recording. So it's just the way things have gone. And yeah, is it matter? Does it matter? Probably not, but it's the OCD in me that is making me do it. So anyway, that's the difference.
We also have a minor difference with how we deal with our completed/posted files, basically the final compilations that we have exported from our editors. And for me, I basically separate my video and audio files, the files that are uploaded to YouTube and my media host. Those ones are separated to 2 different folders. Now, the reason why I do this is because back when I was trying to put everything onto a bunch of different hard drives within my one computer before I had a NAS, I was really trying to balance data. So the idea being I had one hard drive that could take all of the completed video files and also another hard drive that had the completed audio files, and then another hard drive that had the production project folders that we just mentioned a few minutes ago. The idea being that hard drives were only affordable up to a certain size, so I needed multiple drives, and thus I kind of scattered the data. I also kind of like the idea of having them on multiple drives just as another fail point, but that was something that that was how that started. And then when I moved to my NAS, I have just kept that going where my project files are in their own folder with associated subfolders. And then I just have a big project or a big folder for the posted videos and a big folder for the posted audio. Although I have been a little remiss in separating the audio files, the MP3s, in recent months. I should probably get back on that.
Yeah, as I deal with my completed files, they are both the MP4s and the MP3s in the episode subfolder. However, for ease of searchability and to easily copy the MP3 tags over to a new file, and I use a program called Tag and Rename just to copy and paste onto the new file, I have a subfolder on my archive 20 terabyte drive for all the final files for all of my shows, at least the MP3s. And this is what is uploaded to my media host provider. And once again, these are all backed up to Backblaze. So I do have not only a copy in my working drive, I also have a copy on the final drive, in some cases too, when I actually move the episode subfolder over. And I also have a copy in the completed files. So, and Backblaze. So yeah, I feel pretty secure about that. And of course, also the published files that are on the media host and YouTube.
Additionally, we should note right now that the process of uploading to multiple destinations could be considered an archive process, but maybe we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Last part of our workflow that we wanted to mention about archiving is the website, because quite frankly, the website archive is primarily just going to be routine backups because we do archive our website. And the way that I do this is there's twofold. Number one, I do heavily bank on the automatic backups that come with our web host, but also every now and then, especially if there's something large that's changed, I will go in and manually back up a copy of the website and keep that on a local folder. And then through the times that go on and that folder gets a little bit larger, I do decide when I might purge that folder. There isn't anything specific on that. It's just kind of like, hey, look, this folder is getting a bit large. I think what I'll do is clear out a bunch of the intermediates and maybe keep one from this month and one from the month before, and essentially just on the fly decide how much historical information I'm going to keep in those local backups. But that is something I tried to archive the old copies of the website because you never know when you're going to need that. And that is something that I have had to do before, is dig into the archive because something's gone wrong and I needed to go and extract that information. And I was glad that I had that. And since I am talking about backups and archiving the data, the one thing I do want to address is archiving old content, because for us, it is rare on the website that we actually need to pull something off of the website. But in the occasions that we have had to pull something off the website, the way that we tend to archive this is just by turning it into a draft that people can't see publicly. It's very rare that we actually like to go to our web presence and fully delete something. We usually like to just make it so nobody can see it. That way, if we ever do need to refer to it in the future, it's kind of in an archive state, which is really just a draft mode. So from a web perspective, that's something we like to do as our sort of archiving practice.
And I have gone into the WordPress instance and actually searched for keywords and actually pulled stuff up that has been archived there. Okay. So now we've talked a bit about our archiving process. Let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. And no, we're not talking about my stack and books of SD cards that I'm holding up for the video watcher right now. We're talking about the fact that we recognize a lot of people may not want to pack as much data around as we do. So before we get into explaining some alternative ways that you may want to archive, we do want to at least set the stage on why we like to pack rat data. We both have had situations come up multiple times where we've had to delve into our original multi-tracked project file. And sometimes we've wanted to be able to just get the one track from that file And there's also something about the fact that this is a hobby for us, and keeping the data is sort of fun for us to archive that much data and have it available at home, not anywhere else. So we have put countless hours into editing our podcasts over the years, and the project files were a key part of that labor of love. So yeah, we keep them around like little pets or kids or whatever. So anyway,
Yeah, my kids are stored in an SD folder. You're right. Yeah.
yeah, right here. Back to what we were saying though. Let's say you're not as crazy as us, and that's not a far-fetched thing, but okay, I digress. How might you archive your podcast? For the purposes of this conversation, we're going to focus primarily on the project and completed files, as we think those are the ones that are most likely for people to be looking at to save in some way, manner, or form, or if you just want to save some bytes on the total and you don't want to pack rat as much as we are. So one method you could use is to establish some timelines on when you actually move on past the project. Is it time related? Is it a number of episodes ago? And that's really up to you on what your best practice is. But the idea would be that after this period expired, you would say goodbye to the working files and just keep your final compiled podcast files. We're going to highly advocate that you keep these locally. Do not trust the upload to whatever media host you have. And that's for a variety of different issues that we've noticed throughout the years. A media service might get hacked, or there could be a DDoS that could be implemented, or they could lose their entire history. And I have a few examples. Remember that MySpace data loss a few years ago where they lost literally petabytes of data? Yeah, you might not care except for if those were your creations on MySpace, and that was the only place that they were. Or maybe even the old Twitter archives data loss. Yeah, it was temporary as far as we know, but what if it wasn't? And for those of you that are unaware, Twitter did experience a time period where older tweets, and I am referring to Twitter here, I'm not referring to X, that older tweets past a certain date were just not available for a little while. I think it's come back, but say it wasn't, right? And so all that data is gone. If you had old clamors, for instance, if you were a clamorer in the app and the only place those files were was on your old Twitter account, they could have been gone. And that is just an example. So in this scenario, you are going to have the mindset that you are only going to care about the final input, the final save, the final published file. And you are going to be okay never having to go back to the edit of the file again. The reason that we'd recommend having that rollover period that I discussed a little bit ago is just in case something comes up with a recent episode that you decide you need to. Sometimes you may not notice a mistake until a listener points it out. And if you wait a limited period, you're more likely to have those raw edit files ready when somebody does hear it and points out your mistake. You could have muted a track at the end, like your outro. You could have had somebody only in the left channel, something like that, right? So it's important to have those edit files at least available for a little while. But what about if you want to find a middle ground? Well, if you have the time or some technical abilities to automate things, you could create compressed copies of your source files. And this is something that Stephen is very adept at.
This is something that I've seen through the rumblings of the years of online media outlets doing this with their data. Basically, once a project is posted, they have a criteria where certain media ends up being compressed to a reduced format that they archive. So they have that information if they ever need to, but it's at reduced quality. The information that meets that criteria, they know they might eventually need to go back to and get, but they know that in those situations, they're okay with having it at a reduced quality. So let's say you wanted to apply this to your podcast and you wanted to maintain yourself multi-track versions of your podcast production files. But you're going to say, I'm okay with the reduced quality. What you could theoretically do, if you wanted to save yourself those bytes, is you could establish a routine where after a certain period, instead of just deleting, like we mentioned a few minutes ago, you might convert those waves or those FLAC files over to a reduced quality like an MP3. So you're still going to have everybody's individual tracks, but you are going to have them at a reduced quality. So we would, in this situation, highly recommend that you do still keep a full quality output file in this scenario if you do ever need to go back. So we might suggest you have a final save of everybody all together in higher than you've posted, so you've at least got that in an elevated quality. But you could save yourself keeping a bunch of FLAC or WAV files around by only keeping those individual tracks at a reduced quality. Alternatively, you might consider building a criteria for files that do go through this and ones that don't, and this could be based off of the type of episode, or maybe an asset you use in there, or something else for your specific needs. Let's say you have a podcast where you regularly have guests on the show. Maybe these are the shows that you want to keep that full quality. You never know when you might want to reuse that interview or repurpose that guest appearance. Meanwhile, the other shows where you just have your regular hosts on there, maybe those go through the reduced quality process. You could really come up with some form of combination that makes sense for you, but you might want to just think about what is the purpose of keeping this archive and what might be the right balance so that I have the files I need later and have the ones later at a reduced quality that I'm okay with. If you do decide to keep lower quality archives of your show, just be aware that you'll never be able to take advantage of remastering the files at the highest quality that you originally worked with if that ever comes up.
Alternatively, still talking about data archiving, your process might include an online drive service. You're all familiar with these terms: Google Drive, Mediafire, Dropbox, iCloud, etc., whatever it is. This could be a variation of any of the forms that we've described so far today, but the biggest part is that the archiving step ends up being removing it from your local storage and placing it in a private online platform, whatever data that might actually be that you've decided to both place online and eventually pay for, because it's going to be enough data that eventually you're going to have to pay for whatever it is on whatever platform you choose to archive it. We are aware that as people try to transition to say a MacBook that has a limited number of storage on it versus say a PC like Stephen and I have, that you're only going to have so much data available on your machine. So a online drive service or storage service is probably going to be the preference of a large number of hobby podcasters out there. So moving on, though, so far today, we've talked a lot about the data management, essentially archiving the files themselves. But in the same breath of talking about podcast archives, there's a totally different type of podcast archives that we want to at least carve out a place for our conversation today. And that's archiving your actual podcast on the internet. So we made it clear that we suggest hosting your RSS feed and your podcast through a traditional method. Traditionally, that means using something like a media host to host your media and having an active RSS feed. But what happens if your podcast is complete and you want to just keep your podcast available for somebody that wants to download it, but you don't want to keep paying for or managing that RSS feed? Well, in that case, you may want to use an online service to help archive your podcast somewhere that you can just set it and forget it. And some of the examples of this include YouTube, archive.org, Patreon. So yes, even Patreon, and that was part of our media host review, that you could use it for an archive purpose. So when it comes to archiving your podcast online, you should consider a similar thought to what we've discussed so far with data management. Elsewise, you're basically moving that information from one full-fledged area to another, and that likely comes with some restrictions or limitations. For example, if you're simply archiving your podcast on YouTube at this time in November, December of 2024, from a functional perspective, it's like you won't have an RSS feed for people to subscribe to. And thus, your podcast will likely find itself out of the different directories. It's not going to be in podcatchers anymore. You're not going to be able to listen to it on Spotify or on, well, depending on where you host it, or on your podcatcher of choice, whatever that is, Apple Podcasts, Podcast Connect, whatever. But that's okay, because if you're actively looking to move your podcast in an archive state, you're probably determined it's okay to do that. We'll come back to that in a bit, by the way, that decision to archive. A similar method could involve moving from a hosting platform that you're not currently using, but offers a free media hosting option. And one of those is Spotify for podcasters, which is why I mentioned Spotify as a caveat a little bit ago. Red Circle has a free plan. Spreaker has a free plan. Currently, all of those have unlimited data that you can put on their platform and associate it with an RSS feed. There are other options out there, but they come with limits, most notably the amount of episodes or hours that you can host. And a couple of examples is Acast and Podbean, but there are others. And as we discussed in season 4 of Better Podcasting, we created our own criteria for reviewing media hosts. And you may have your own, by the way. That might mean that the media host that you choose wasn't free. But if you are going to be archiving your podcast itself, do those criteria even still matter to you? Probably not. However, you should be aware that in the process of archiving your podcast on another platform, it's likely that information is going to break somewhere. For example, if you have media hosted on your old platform linked to a neutral website, those links are probably going to break unless you spend time updating them, right, Stephen?
Yeah, and that could be a part of your podcast archiving process. If you're even going to keep said website around, which is going to be a decision in itself that you'll have to make. But if you do keep that website around and it has links to all of that media, you might have to go and update those, which would be part of the archive process. Or if you are lucky and information somehow doesn't break, it could just mean that you're going to have a lesser experience than you are used to. Let's say, for example, you have statistics on your current platform that you're not going to have on the free platform that you move to. They might be different or more limited compared to what you have been traditionally used to, maybe even non-existent. These are things that you have to be aware of. Or perhaps you're going to lose specific features that you have on your chosen media host. Maybe you have a bunch of subscriptions currently going on that. Well, if you move to a free platform that doesn't offer that or offers them differently, you might lose those subscriptions. If you have a media host that has dynamic ad insertion, well, that's going to change if you change media hosts. Or perhaps to the whole website thing, what if your website itself is actually on your media host? You're going to lose that as well as you migrate media hosts. There's also the chance you might lose access to different podcast directories if you set those up through your existing media host. Let's say that you did choose to push your podcast to a specific destination and you had that set up through your media host. When you go and change to that archive platform that you've chosen, that connection will essentially break. Yes, the 301 redirect should take care of moving the RSS feed, but the actual owner of that directory, the link that's currently there to your media host, will break. Might you need it because you're going to an archive state? Probably not, but you need to be aware that that sort of thing might happen.
In any case, the archiving process of your podcast online will involve you making the conscious decision to change your podcast from an active state to a passive state. So do any of these things really matter when you're talking about what you've done to set up your show to begin with? Probably not. With that said, when you do make the decision to move your podcast from an active state to that archived or passive state, you're likely going to need some time you're going to have to invest if you want to accomplish this properly. For example, let's say you chose the YouTube method we mentioned. After all, YouTube is easy, right? It's a free service. It's where a lot of people go to get content, and Google just takes care of the rest, right? Well, not exactly. In the context of archiving your podcast, if you choose this method, you're going to have to, A, convert all of your episodes to a video, since YouTube only accepts video as of 2024. 2, upload them in some form to YouTube. And also, assuming you want them at least semi-complete, you'll need to transfer data to them, such as titles and descriptions. And that doesn't even include things like starting up a channel, transferring the artwork, etc. But here's the thing. If you want to make things a little easier for yourself down the road, you can anticipate archiving while your podcast is in an active state, assuming you'll be okay with the trade-offs that come up with this. What we mean by that is you could actively make uploading to multiple platforms part of your regular routine. Although we're not really the biggest fans of having your media host automatically post to YouTube with static image because of all the complications of the algorithm on YouTube, the upside to doing this is that you're essentially building an archive as you go. This could be the same if your media host supports a destination that serves its own version of the files. In these situations, if you ever wanted to close down your primary RSS feed, you just have to look at how you claim back that listing directly so that you can disconnect it from linking to your media host.
And the last method we want to discuss today about how you might archive your podcast is one that involves paying still for the media host. This is a real feasible option and arguably perhaps one of the easiest one if your media host does fit into this category. If your media host offers the ability to downgrade or reduce the plan that you're paying for, you could potentially do that to save yourself some money, but you will still be paying on an ongoing basis. Some examples of this include Podbean. You could downgrade to the $9 per month plan with RSS.com. You could potentially, if you fit into the category, get yourself a reduced plan there for $4.99. Or with Pinecast, you might be able to get away with just getting rid of all the add-on features maybe you added for your Pinecast and just stick with the $10 starter plan. Really, the idea is looking at what you're currently paying for on your media host and seeing, is there things I can cut out to have a cheaper option available that I can be comfortable just paying on a reduced basis, on an ongoing basis, to keep that podcast online in an archived state?
With all of those archive processes that we discuss, there are some big picture archiving considerations that we think you might want to have. You should be aware that every archive process is going to take some time, some organization, and likely some cost as well. You should start by asking yourself what your intention is with archiving the data. Although we've largely stayed away from the topic of backups today, in a sense, archiving is really a form of backing up your podcast content. You're essentially backing up your posted podcast by keeping certain production files or resources available for later use. Since the goal is to maintain data in a somewhat cold state, that means that you likely want to make sure that if or when it becomes time to access this information again, it's there for you to use. There are a few high-level considerations that we will mention that may fall a little bit more in the realm of backup, but it's worth considering just the same for archiving. And that is, you may want to have multiple copies of the data. You might want to explore different things like rotating out an external USB drive and place it in a safe deposit box. And that is to help with geographical separation. Say there's a natural disaster like a hurricane, a tornado, flood, fire, earthquake, something like that. If it's not in your house and your house or your apartment, wherever you live or wherever you work, then at least you have a copy of the data somewhere else, even if it's relatively local, but that it's not hit with a localized thing like a tornado or a flood. And there's also consideration for multiple copies. I'm sure you've heard the term 321, have 3 copies of the file in at least 2 different places, and then likely you'll end up with 1 copy in the end, right? So there's also the possibility of data corruption. So having 2 different files that are never deleted and that you can do some sort of compare and contrast to eventually, you'll run the less risk of actually having data corruption and losing that data. I don't know if you're new to podcasting, if you have had a wonderful opportunity to going back to a file that you think is there, but you can't open it for a variety of different reasons. And one of those reasons could be data corruption. And that really sucks. So if you have more than 1 copy of the file, likely you'll be able to access it and it won't have gone to that corruption state. So ask yourself, what are you okay losing and what do you absolutely want to have down the road? The answer to these are going to lead you to what your target will be for your archiving process. But once you've determined that you need to consider your budget and how much time you can spend to achieve this archiving goal, this might depend on how organized of a person that you are. Somebody who isn't reliably organized may not want to embark on the idea of a hybrid archive system that depends on converting files to another format. It's a lot of work if you're lazy. And how will this turn out in reality? It's okay to be honest with yourself and say you just can't see yourself doing that. It's also going to take a lot of your time. As we mentioned earlier in the show, one of the reasons our planning documents are a bit of a chaos is because we don't move them until it becomes a nuisance in our Google Drive. That's just an example. We just let it roll until one of us goes, eh, and we've never questioned each other on it because the data is still there. It's just in the archive folder. But you may also want to consider how your archiving solution fits in with your backup solution. As mentioned, we are advocates of backing up your data. And if you are archiving a lot of your podcast data, that is going to affect how much backup space you are going to need. How big is that drive? This could be an online solution, like we mentioned before with a cloud drive, or it could be a local solution, on-prem, like hard drives. Although we should emphasize once again that the best data protection solutions involve multiple points. Additionally, you may want to consider the pricing of online storage compared to local storage. When you go over a terabyte of online storage, you might be fine with the pricing, but eventually it starts to increase rapidly. And compare the recurring cost of that to something like an external drive. But now we're getting into the weeds. And to be honest with you, Steven's an ass, and I just don't want to go there today.
I don't want to go there either. But we just wanted to point out that the backup problem has been one that we've seen affect people's archiving decision. Because again, depending on what you're doing with that data, and that includes your show, the cost of what you are doing to back that up might affect your decision. Now, another caution we have is that when you're dealing with collaboration solutions, you want to consider that, unfortunately, your collaborators might break your plan, and it's not necessarily maliciously either. Let me give you an example here. There was a podcast that one of us had that we'll leave nameless, and the planning documents were archived basically in Google Drive in a similar method actually to what we described for Better Podcasting. Pack ratting again. Well, some of these files were created by a co-host who moved on from the podcast, so became a former co-host, and one day they just decided that they were going to clean up their Google Drive. Well, since these files were listed on their drive because they created them in the original folder, it became part of their cleanup process, and they ended up deleting those files, not realizing that it wasn't just removing it from their storage, it was removing the files altogether. It wasn't malicious, but it just ended up impacting that archive solution that had been established. So if you are archiving in a collaborative environment, maybe take that as an opportunity to assess what data they have and how you might need to make a little tweak right there and then to ensure that that archiving process works going forward.
Finally, when you decide to archive your show, there's going to be some fallout that you need to be prepared for. And you need to be certain, first of all, that you're ready to let that RSS feed go if you remove your show from a hosting service. You're going to lose historical data. You probably are going to lose the ability to download and listen to your show in podcatchers. And you're going to make sure that you have a backup of your files and show descriptions if you actually delete the account. If you're keeping it around, ensure people know that it is not active. Some media host providers have a field to archive or label your show as complete. You should probably go ahead and do that. But you should also say farewell to your audience and let them know what the future plans are for your show and for you yourself so that they know where to find you if you're going to continue on with other projects. Finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that there is one final option that you have in the context of archiving your podcast itself. You can always choose to delete your show versus archiving your show. However, there might be consequences of that will hit you later, such as using the work as a whole as a resume builder. And true story, Better Podcasting actually helped me win some awards at work and with my latest job interview process and getting a new job. Or perhaps in the future, when you're looking at ad buys or media kits, to be able to display your entirety of work actually can be a bonus in some cases. Also, if you wish to use the show as a reference material later, having it easily available is all good for both you and your audience members. I mean, there's some shows that I've listened to in the past that at least have had websites that had archived the stuff or forums. And then when those went away, I'm like, oh, well, I guess I don't have those anymore. Not mine, but I felt the loss of it. So just be aware of that. So before you take your show completely offline, which could very well be your desire for good reasons, make sure you consider all the second and third order effects before you do, because once you do, there's no going back. In summary, archiving your show is probably going to be the last decision and action you take with your project when you decide it's time for it to become inactive. Whilst on the flip side, archiving your podcast project files might be an ongoing process that you do while your show is active. But as with anything with podcasting, it's best done with deliberate planning and consideration of the various aspects, wherever it's, for instance, deleting, completing, and or archiving your show. Of course, it will be easier on you if you make these decisions and enact those decisions along the way. And as a final note, with any podcasting topic, if you need help evaluating your decision space, feel free to drop in our Discord and ask some questions. Things change all the time in podcasting, and getting the latest and greatest information is going to help you, especially in the final decision for your show, in this case, archiving. Plus, you not only get to tap our knowledge, Stephen and mine, but you get to tap our community's knowledge as well. And that is a lot of history of hobby podcasting that is in our community. And odds are you'll be able to bring some knowledge to the table as well. We'd also really like to hear from people who have made the conscious decision not to participate in any archiving for their podcast, whether that's referring to archiving project materials or the podcast itself. What went into your decision? How did you do it? Was it just a delete and move on with life? Whatever it is, we would love to hear from you. So check it out, betterpodcasting.com/Discord, and we hope to see you there and hear how you archive or any of your questions about hobby podcasting.
All right, it's the Better Podnerings time, and we're going to start off talking about Spotify. We mentioned Spotify already once today, which means that there's automatically news that is made in the podcast world. I think that's what happens anytime we reference Spotify.
It is. Stephen and I both received invites, personal invites from the Spotify team to go and participate in their event called Now Playing this past week. And we traveled there and we actually sat in the audience for this, right?
Yeah, 100% true. No.
Yeah, Spotify, you should reach out for us next time. Just saying.
We did not.
Yeah, Spotify has been in the podcast game since 2019, according to their Now Playing website. And while the podcast ecosystem is as vibrant as it's ever been, the definition of a podcast is now more fluid. Ooh, that caught my attention.
Oh, it's almost like they are saying something we have been saying for a very long time.
Yeah, they are in on it as well. And honestly, I think this is just pumping up their decision to pivot to video, but it still works in the favor of everybody, right? Because when you talk to somebody that's not a podcaster, they think that a YouTube video or something, a video that they see on whatever platform, including Spotify, is a podcast. So creators are, this is again, according to Spotify on their webpage, creators are experimenting and engaging audiences in new ways through video, and podcast fans want the flexibility to seamlessly watch or listen to content depending on what they are doing. There was different things announced at this Now Playing event, like clips, thumbnails, and there was an email that they sent out. So that is not quite the personal invitation that Stephen and I would prefer, but we did both receive it.
Yeah, and so really these are features that they're creating to enhance the video side of things. That's the gist of it, is they're really widening the breadth of what is possible here with Spotify, and I think this is smart. I do think this is smart. I know there's still a lot of curmudgeoning people out there who are actively going against video, but like you said, that's not what the general public is seeing a podcast to be. And so they, as a company, needs to adapt with what people's expectations are, consumer expectations. And so if consumers are expecting to have video aspects as well, this is something that they need to accommodate, or they'll be having those consumers find their stuff elsewhere. So this makes a lot of sense. And I think that I'm hesitant to see how big of an impact this will have. I guess time will tell, but I'm glad to see it being a little better supported.
So we both pay for YouTube Premium, right?
Yes, we do.
So I think if people don't pay for YouTube Premium and they get fed up with the literal ton of ads that's being served up, and they want to experience video content elsewhere that does not have a ton, might still have some, but doesn't have a ton of ads on it, I could see people pivoting to somewhere else. I think there's been two camps of video in 2024. First of all, there's been the long-term rise that we've seen over years, and we talked about it on Better Podcasting, over the general public just terming anything that is not mainstream media as a podcast, right? So there's that. And then there's also the camp within the industry in this year specifically that has gotten on board, not because of the general public and what they call a podcast, but because of the ad revenue that's available to them. So the industry is very, very intrigued on video from that aspect because they can sell video ads at a lot higher price than they can audio ads. So they're just very interested in getting that sweet video ad streaming dollars.
Moving on to our next Better Podnering. SP, I had an idea the other day. You know this, that I have, since I departed the iOS world, I have been an avid Google user over the years. I had a Google Nexus phone. And then once the Pixel came out, I had a Google Pixel 1 and a Pixel 2. I even had a Pixel 4a and a Pixel 6. And then last year I decided, because of some quirks, I was going to move to a Samsung phone. So I finally threw a towel in and I went to a Samsung S23
Note
Ultra
7.
phone. No, not a Note 7. I as much as I wanted the Note 7 for, keep me warm. I decided to go with the Samsung S23 Ultra. And so I was thinking, been using that for over a year now. Maybe it's time for me to move over to Samsung Podcasts.
Yeah. So another true story is that when I went to Podcast Movement and I went to the iHeartRadio party in downtown Nashville, I actually met the guy that was behind the Samsung podcast, both the corporate podcast and their Samsung podcast service. Well, they sent out an email to the people that are buying ads and stuff earlier this week that it's set to close on 1 December 24. So apparently nobody was using it and they were just cutting it as a loss of the Samsung corporate structure. And my condolences, my legit condolences is out to their team because I know they had a very small team that was working this, but I hope they're pivoting to something else within the company. Odds are they're probably not, but I hope that the team is being taken care of basically as they move forward, just because I met them personally and thought there were okay people back then. I have no idea if they're still the same people, by the way, and I have no idea if they're still employed, but if they are, then I wish them the best. But in the grand scheme of things, when you're talking about the stats of where people consume podcasts, Samsung Podcasts hasn't been a major player in that. It hasn't made major inroads whatsoever, even into the high single digits, which is where I would really say this is where your bread and butter is. If you're trying to make it into the space, you want to make it into the high single digits of consumption. And I've never seen Samsung Podcasts anywhere close to that. It's always been below 8%, well below 8%. You can find these stats various different places. Buzzsprout has a statistics page that's available for anybody to go see, as well as a couple other places that get podcast statistics on where the shows that they're hosting are actually being consumed, and Samsung has just not been there. So RIP Samsung Podcasts, and I hope that eventually Android gets some sort of central hub like the iOS structure has with Apple Podcasts. Love it or hate it, Apple Podcasts is still a major player. They might not be the prime player of over 50%, but they're still a major player in podcast consumptions. And I hope eventually Android gets that as well.
As an Android user myself, I'm going to hope for it not. And the reason I hope not is because I'd like to see it continue to dwindle on iOS until it is more neutral players out there, because I think neutral experiences is going to overall be beneficial to users out there. So if they do change devices, some places people can only have a certain device for some reason, I'd like to be able to see the main player be something that's not tied to a specific platform.
Every time they've tried that, Google Podcast with what was that other S one that was out there? Not Spotify, but I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. That recently closed at the beginning of the year. Every time they try that, it has not worked. So while I would love to see a neutral player be part of it, I guess Spotify is as close as you're going to get.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm referring to. And I don't like the idea of all the eggs being in one basket, but I would much prefer it if there was two big neutral players like Spotify that had a neutral service that had the majority share of podcast listening, and then Apple Podcasts can still be there, but just as a secondary player.
The one I was thinking of is Stitcher. I think possibly if Alphabet gets behind it and doesn't kill it, YouTube Music or YouTube Podcasts potentially in the future might be that secondary one that you're talking about, because that is neutral, quote unquote neutral as well. I don't know.
I guess we'll see. Who knows?
Yep.
Well, you know what else we'll see is how well the new Rode Wireless Micro works out, because Rode did announce new hardware. And as we know from our entire year and more, Rode only makes flawless products. For those of you who don't know, that SP and I both have had Rodecaster Pro and Rodecaster Pro 2 issues in many recent events. But their microphone side of things, Rode did announce a new wireless micro that they say is a pocket-sized wireless microphone that's tailor-made for smartphone creators. It's available in both black and white and can be used through either USB-C or Lightning devices. The idea of this mic is that it does connect directly to phones without the need, of course, for cables. What I really liked when I saw this posted here is it looks so much better than the clip-on Rode mics than we have seen. Yeah. It's still a bit of an eyesore. If I'm being honest, I would much rather have a lav mic based solution that is even smaller than this, but this is the idea of a clip-on microphone is a lot more convenient for some people, and I think this looks a lot better than that, and they say it is their smallest one yet.
Yeah, so really there's 4 options. There's a black and white in 2 versions. There's a Lightning version, and then there is a USB-C version. So it's not like you can buy one and it will work with both. It'll either be Lightning or USB-C. So keep that in mind. I also don't know if it works for tablets as well as the phones themselves. I assume it does, but I don't know that for sure. And then if you've watched the video, by the way, because there was a video announcement from Rode that came out of that, the guy that was presenting, he refused to use the word dead cat, because, you know, those fuzzy things that prevent the wind from listening through microphones, they are commonly referred to in the industry as dead cats. And he said everything but dead cats when he was talking about it. So obviously he has an aversion to saying dead cat on the microphone thing. It is slightly larger because it's wireless. They have to power it and it has to have some sort of transmitter in it. So, okay. But I think this is going to serve more and more of the not necessarily podcaster, what we would consider traditional podcaster, but an influencer or maybe a YouTuber. I think it will help those people out more than just podcasters. But inevitably, podcasters will use this because they'll see it and they're like, hey, I can do that. That's cheap. That's easy. I can use it with my existing device. And then that's fine. And if you're able to do that, more power to you. I still think if you're producing long form audio content, you still need a dynamic microphone inside a studio. This is not me being a curmudgeon. This is me being realistic with your post-production headaches that will inevitably come from using this system.
The one thing that I did want to call out is they do have a couple of sound features that they're touting that I look forward to waiting and seeing how they work in execution. The first is that they have a, quote, patent pending acoustic chamber design that apparently is meant to capture, quote, exceptionally clear and intelligible audio, end quote. And then they also have what they call an intelligent gain assist technology to control the audio levels, which that is pretty important for something like a clip-on mic, because generally, I think the people who are using these clip-on mics aren't going to be monitoring live unless you have a multi-team with you. So being able to clip it on.
I don't think there's any reason. I don't think there's any capability to monitor live.
Fair enough. But the idea is you're clipping it on. And so if you start with somebody who's like, thanks for interviewing me today, and then they're like, thanks for continuing my interview at this level, that's going to be a problem for the audio levels and might increase the amount of background noise that you're trying to fight through in the final process. So let's see how the intelligent gain assist works, but that could be really critical for this sort of use case.
One thing that I commonly see on the R podcasting subreddit is people wanting an outdoor microphone for talking and walking, or talking and biking, or talking whatever. If you're going to be outside and you're going to be moving, especially into windy environments, you're going to get that wind noise in there. Ask me how I know, because I tried to capture some cycling earlier this year, and the wind noise on my GoPro was just absolutely horrendous. And I went through mitigation steps to make it better. And GoPros themselves have some digital patent pending acoustic whatever, that probably, like what Rode is saying, that helps. But when you're going 25 miles an hour and the microphone is right into the wind, no matter of windscreen, dead cats, or post-production processing is going to really take that out. It's going to sound like you're underwater, and it's going to sound like there's wind being mitigated in there. So it depends on what you're trying to do, on whether you can hear that or not. I can tell you, listening and watching to sailing YouTubes, when they are out on the boat and they're trying to talk to each other, sometimes in stressful situations, which is why they even publish it, it's in the wind and it's very difficult to hear them. And those cases just prove to me, because they're using the latest and greatest as well. They're using these clip-on microphones, and they're using dead cats, and they're using small shotgun microphones that are meant for their cameras and stuff like that. And it's just horrendous. However, those content creators that sail and do the YouTube channels, also some of them do podcasts, and they have podcast setups with roadcasters and with pod mics and whatever, and they sound completely different. So they are aware of the limitations, but the idea with the sailing YouTube channel isn't audio. The idea is to actually show what's going on around them, whether they're going to adventurous, wonderful places, or whether they're in the midst of something that's chaotic, either with weather or something's wrong with the boat or something like that. So I get that. But yeah, get back to that patent pending acoustic chamber thing. Yeah, it'll probably work for some, but not everybody. And I don't think there is a solution for everybody, because even with great microphones on movie sets that cost tens of thousands of dollars, you still have to have issues with environmental sound.
I'm kind of surprised to hear your feedback or even comments on this, because you're talking about the difficulty that wind creates. And it was my understanding, as you get older, it's more likely that you cut wind.
Not necessarily from your mouth.
Fair enough. Well, on that stupid note, should we go to some much smarter people and go to our Better Podback?
Yes, because everybody wants to hear from anybody else but us after that.
This is where we here at Better Podcasting turn the show over to you as we run through some of your feedback. We call this segment Better Podback.
So apparently Audacity changed, hey?
Yeah, it's been changing for quite some time. Remember, we covered the fact that somebody actually bought it and was curating it, and it wasn't just the free form shareware that it has been for quite some time. Josh Liston in our Discord piped up and he said, I use Audacity for some multi-track editing before moving those assets over to Audition to mix, add special effects, and master my audio projects. But the latest version of Audacity, which for him is 3.7.0 for macOS, is just dang ugly. The color scheme and the overall look is making for hard work. Does anybody know if Audacity allows for any changes to track colors, etc.? I've looked in all the places I expect to find the dashboard controls and found nothing that applies to colors and waveform visuals. Also, I understand the software is free, but the other features of the software have been massively leveled up over the past 18 to 24 months, so I'm just putting the question out there. Thanks in advance. And there was some back and forth. I actually commented that I have a quite older version of Audacity that I haven't upgraded at all, but Randy Walker came in And he said, I think you can pick classic from the preferences, interface, theme option. It will go back to looking similar to the way it did before. And Josh listened and said, thanks, Mike. That worked a treat. I missed that drop down complete.
Oh, Josh, I look forward to your comment about that right now. That was a spot-on Australian accent. Way to go there. Way to go, SB.
It's like I've never been there before.
So if you're fighting with this problem, go check that out. That's where you can change that back. I wonder how long they'll keep that around. I hope it's a while, because people have grown used to a certain look. But also in the past, eventually classic looks do seem to fade into oblivion.
As we've discussed before, I'm curious as to whether waveform editors will persist for hobbyists for a very long time, right? I don't know when that transition is going to be, but as more and more capabilities are out there for AI editing just on the transcript alone, I think less and less people will be able to edit through whatever, if it's mobile device or whatever, the application just won't exist to do waveform edits anymore. So I just don't know when that's going to be or ever, but I am concerned about it because I see more and more people going the way of textual editing.
The next thing we wanted to chat about was in our Discord. Following up to our website episode, we had Waffles from Play Comics. He said, WordPress gang! Exclamation point. So he was excited to shout out that he was part of the WordPress gang. And then in context to the Elementor plugin, we mentioned DC Dave said, I didn't realize Elementor plugin could be used without using their service. I was looking at PowerPress, but figured based on the security incident, you were not suggesting them. So 2 parts. Number 1, Elementor does have a free tier and a paid tier. So when you do I believe it's when you do the second line themes Bolden plugin, that is something that Elementor is a part of that, and it's the free version. For PowerPress, yeah, there was the security incident. At the moment, though, there still isn't a lot of alternative that is out there that offers the same level of features. And with the Bolden plugin, they do pretty much use PowerPress. I believe there's some ways you can work around it a little bit, but last I knew out of the box, PowerPress was one of the plugins that they did recommend you installed. The security incident wise, yeah, it was pretty ridiculous, quite frankly, how that happened. It was pretty disappointing. I would like to hope that they have improved their security on that since, because it was, I believe, a developer account that was compromised. So hopefully Blueberry has gone and clawed back the proper authorizations that was to whatever that developer account was, and it's all been rectified. I don't know. I guess time will tell.
Time will indeed tell. We haven't heard of another breach since that, so I don't know. Maybe they're good for now. And I don't know if PowerPress fits under Blueberry or under Raw Voice, or maybe it's its own company. I have no idea, because it's like this free thing out to the side, and I don't know about what Todd has in his corporate pyramid structure or anything. I really just don't pay attention to it. But PowerPress, for better or for worse, is from that family of companies. So yeah.
Good point.
Yep. We also had a feedback from DC Dave in the Discord, and he said, I did notice something while looking at the Gonna Geek website tonight. And this is, I have to admit, I did not notice this at all. And I'm glad that he did. I think he was looking at things because he was setting up his own website. In any event, it was a very astute observation. And Stephen, what exactly is in your profile?
Well, he noticed on my profile that I have a very, very old personal bio that's on there. I honestly haven't looked at it in forever. In fact, I literally copied and pasted it from the old site to the new site when we upgraded that a while back. And one of the excerpts from this says Nexus ? Nexus. Period. Star Trek versus Star Wars ? Star Trek every time. Con! Sorry, that was a terrible con. And then he noticed...
Well, the original one was terrible too, but anyway.
Fair enough. And then he noticed on your Gonna Geek profile picture, there was a picture of you, and on the seat behind you was a band that said Star Wars on it. So he was pointing out the conflict between the two of us, that I called out Star Trek in favor of Star Wars, and that you literally were rocking in your profile picture as a Star Wars logo.
Yeah, and I have to admit that because this came to light, we are in separation talks right now for Better Podcasting, and while we do anticipate another season, I can't guarantee anything beyond season 6.
You know, there is nothing that gets between two podcasters more than a Star Wars versus Star Trek debate. It's just nothing bigger.
In reality, growing up, I like both of them, so I'm not pro or against one or the other. I was Battlestar Galactica. I mean, I'm all sci-fi fan. I'm not like, this has to be it. Matter of fact, it didn't even enter into my mind that somebody would be pro one sci-fi and anti another sci-fi until I heard about this big Star Wars versus Star Trek thing, like years into my life. I think I was late 30s, early 40s before I really discovered that there are actual camps out there that despised one and promoted the other. I'm like, it's all made up anyway, guys. Just enjoy the stories.
Fair point. So if you have anything you'd like to say about podcasting or Star Trek and Star Wars, come fight it out in the Discord at betterpodcasting.com/Discord. And our last piece of Better Podback is from the one and only, the honorary third co-host of Better Podcasting, Damien the DM.
And Damien the DM spoke up in our Discord and he said, I know you don't usually get into monetization. We don't. But Patreon just announced some changes, upcoming changes, and hinted at commitments to better support podcasts on Patreon. I've got an email from them about it, if neither of you do, that I can forward along. And we're not going to go over the contents of the email, but just know that Patreon is trying to service their creators a little bit better because there are more options out there now than Patreon. And I think they're feeling the crunch of some of the content creators are going elsewhere. And so they want to keep as many people on their platform as they can. And they're trying to serve specific communities, not just podcasters, but there are several other specific communities of creators that they really want to try to serve and reduce the hemorrhaging from their platform. In that light, the improvements that they make might actually be very beneficial to podcasters versus other platforms out there that talk about monetization.
If you have any experience with this, you can also come to our Discord and chat it up. Although we don't tend to talk about money here, there are people who do occasionally chat about it on our Discord. So come on over there to betterpodcasting.com/Discord. Or again, for that Star Wars versus Star Trek debate. Go ahead.
I'm sure that we've rekindled the fires along the way. Matter of fact, JS and Wing might be back for it.
All right, we got one more episode after this one. It's our gear episode, so we hope you come back next week. But we are going to see you, hopefully, in 2025. We will be there. We're hoping you join us. We should kick off around mid-January, so come on over to betterpodcasting.com/Discord to find out all the specifics. Once we have that all locked in, we will, at least we anticipate, continue to stream our live recording sessions when we do them. We anticipate they will continue to be chaotic as they have been so far for this season, and we hope that you can at least check out one of them occasionally, because you can see us make all sorts of errors as we record. And if there's anything that we want you to know, it's that we are very, very, very flawed.
We are. And if you actually want to use what we have streamed out as our raw recording and then look at our final recording later, our final published version later on, and if you want to study how Steven edits and the back and forth between the two, you're more than welcome to do that and to get tips and tricks from that along the way if you want to get studious of that. Also, I want to say that we are beginning our talks about what we're going to cover in season 6 of Better Podcasting. I've already got a few ideas that I have written down, and we've talked about a few as well. But if you have any topics that you would like to see us cover in season 6 of Better Podcasting, starting in mid-January on, then please let us know. As Stephen mentioned before, our recordings will probably be even more chaotic than they have been this fall, because of now we're adding in another dimension with me, which we will talk about next season, and we'll just go from there. But hopefully we will continue to produce and publish the podcast on time. What time that is will be a future discussion that Stephen and I need to have, but we will talk about it as we move into next year. It's been a fun year. I know we have one more episode left, and it's a favorite episode of both ours and our audience. So we hope you enjoy it, and we hope to see you back next year.
So for episode number 311 of Better Podcasting, I'm Steven saying, I can't wait to discuss gear next week with you.
And MSP saying it has been a unusual gear year. So we'll see everybody next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for checking out another episode of Better Podcasting. You can find the full back catalog of Better Podcasting at betterpodcasting.com. If you're into geeky podcasts, please check out the other podcasts on the Gonna Geek Network at gonnageeknetwork.com. This show was produced and edited by Stephen Jondrew. Voice work was done by L.W. Salinas. Thanks again for listening or watching, and we hope to see you again next week.